All right, so in this part three, I want to speak to what I think is the value of playing, and I guess also in my case at least, designing strategy board games. Why is it that we should bring them to the table, so to speak? Why should we play these strategy board games? And so, in this part, what I'll do is, I guess, more or less lay out a catalog of what I think the benefits are of playing these games. And so I'll speak to what I think people in general can get from playing these games, but then I'll also, especially towards the end of this part, I'll emphasize what it is in particular that I get from them, why it is in particular that I love these kinds of games so much. And you probably already kind of got a sense for that from the first few parts. But I'll dive into, again, much more depth in terms of why it is that I, in particular, love to play these games so much and design them. And I should say that much like was the case, in when I laid out, right, part one, when I laid out what strategy board games are, I'm going to in some of this, borrow from my experience in the UMKC Scholars Program, where I created a business plan, more or less, right, from these for these the strategy board games that I designed. I'm going to so in that process again, I had to do all these various assignments, and so I'll borrow some of my discussion. Right, I actually sat down and really thought about what it was that we can get from playing these games, and so I tried to articulate it. What the value of playing these games, what that is in some of these assignments, and so again, I'll work with some of what I contributed to in terms of those assignments, and I'll expand on some of that. But I just wanted to say again and mention that I'm working with some of that. And so, for in particular, in the middle or towards the end of this part, I'll show you some of the tables that I made at that time to represent again the value we can get or glean from these strategy board games. So anyway, let's go ahead and dive in then. So what is it that I think that we, really the collective we, so not just me, but what do I get, but what do I think we can get from these strategy board games? And so some of this, I should say, is true of, a lot of leisure activities and not just strategy board games. So I'll say that at the outset as well. And so that's going to be true of this first one. But some of them, I'll try to mention, some of the things that I'll mention are maybe more so true of strategy board games and not true of other leisure activities. So, I'll also point out things that sort of stand out about them as well. But, what can we get from a strategy board game, from playing a strategy board game? Well, like other leisurely activities, we can have an escape from the trials and tribulations, right, of our everyday lives. So, oftentimes we have a hard day, let's say at work or at school or whatever the case might be. We had a hard exam, whatever we're going through, right, we can escape it, so to speak, by immersing ourselves in one of these strategy board games. And oftentimes, again, the more thinky they are, at least for me, the more immersed I become, because again, it's requiring more of your thought, more of your attention, at least if you want to do well. And not only that, the other thing I'd mention is the thematic elements of a lot of these board games, some of which I'll mention here or show you here in a moment. The thematic elements, they immerse you even more, right, in this sort of not your reality the rest of that day, right? They help you escape even more, again, given some of those thematic elements. So speaking of which, let's go ahead and dive in. So I brought lots of props to help illustrate some of these points regarding the value of the strategy board games. And so, again, I'm speaking to the themes that become vibrant in our experience of playing these strategy board games. Again, they can help us sort of remove ourselves from whatever we're facing the rest of our day, right? And at least for a while, right? A kind of escape from it, which I think, again, we can all benefit from, as long as we're not trying to escape all day, right? It can help provide that, and the themes in some of these games just help do that even more. So some examples, Thebes, this is one of my favorite games. You're basically an architect digging up, these ancient sort of artifacts, trying to find them. And so what you're doing mechanically in the game is you're digging in. So there's these different regions in the world, right, that you're traveling to, and they have different odds of getting, certain valuable artifacts. And so you're reaching in and to a bag, and a lot of them are just sand. So these tokens you pull out, a lot of them are just sand, but some of them then are artifacts. And so I love that. And the kids, they like this one as well. They love that experience of digging for these artifacts and trying to extract these ancient artifacts. So that's one example of a very thematic game that we like to bring to the table. Another one is Fresco. So this is probably the first one that came to my mind when I was trying to think, well, what's a good game to capture the notion that these strategy board games bring a lot thematically to the table, so to speak. And Fresco was the first one I thought of here, where you are in the game, you're painting, right, the ceiling of a church. And so you have to acquire that. I mean, it's just amazing artwork too in some of these games, really help it stand out. Right, but you have to get the paints together, and then you're getting the different parts then, and trying to paint the different parts of the painting. Very thematic as well. There, Fresco is the name of that one. What else? Oh, Mysterium. That's one that we've been playing a little bit recently. So here's another example of one that I think is super thematic. Toss those to the side when I'm done with them here. So Mysterium here, and this is one of the ones kids and I have been playing a lot recently, where you're kind of psychics. And so if you've watched me in my other videos and my book reviews, right, I'm not usually into the supernatural stuff, but this is a pretty cool game because you're playing like psychics trying to figure out who killed this. So basically you're trying to help a ghost, right, and deduce who killed them originally. And so it's kind of like a deduction game, and you're working, again, it's a cooperative game. You're working together to try to, so the ghost is behind here, and he knows who killed him or herself. So one player's the ghost behind the screen, and they have the identity of the who actually killed them with what. It's kind of like Clue. There's a particular character that killed them with a particular weapon in a particular location. Right, and they know it at the outset. And so what the game is, most of the game, right, is they're trying to then give the psychics, the other players, these clues in terms of who it was, right, that killed them. But they can't do it. The catch is they can't talk. The ghost can't, right, the player that's playing the ghost. They can only use clue cards to signal then who it was, what weapon they used, and so on. So pretty cool sort of feel or vibe that we get the first time we played it. First few times we played it, we lit candles and turned off the lights and so on. So a great example of, again, a game that is very thematic and can help you very easily escape from reality, so to speak, at least for a while. Right. So strategy board games, like other leisurely activities, allows us a temporary escape from our trials and tribulations. But I think what sort of aids strategy board games, in this process more so than other leisurely activities, is again how thematic they are. At least some of them. At least how thematic some of them can be. Okay, then I gave you some examples of kind of games that at least in my collection, that I first associated with being very thematic. So another thing I would point out, a big value that I associate with strategy board games is the educational component and how much you can learn from playing strategy board games. And it really, the more I sort of thought about this and preparing for this, the more I really agree with this point, how educational playing strategy board games can be. So I brought some examples of how that's the case, or at least, again, examples from my collection. And not only are they educational, but they might sort of spark interest in things you didn't know you would have had interest in otherwise before you played the game. I guess that's maybe a slightly different point, but right. So they can also introduce you to interests, right? Spark those interests that you might not have known you had right before you played the game. And actually, one example that I'll mention real quick to that point for me was, and I haven't actually watched a Game of Thrones yet, but I at least became interested. What actually is that series all about after playing the board game in particular? Actually, a nice piggybacking off the previous part 2 of part 2. most of my experience with a Game of Thrones, the board game, is the electronic adaptation of it, right? So on Steam, the electronic version of the game. But anyway, my experience playing that board game, or the electronic version of it, kind of made me interested. Like, whereas I was never interested in the Game of Thrones, I'd heard, people reference it all the time. I knew what it was, but now I'm actually intrigued. If it's ever on, and I'm around, I might actually pay attention to it, whereas before I would have never done that. So I just wanted to mention, again, how there's these cases, and that's one that came into my mind, how that was true for me, where you'll play something and you're like, oh, that's interesting, right? I want to explore that more. But again, going back to the more general point where they're educational. So here's a really cool game. I mentioned the website Yucata. I'm pretty sure you can still play this on Yucata. At least you could for a time. That was my first introduction to Yucata, and to this game. It was on Yucata, and I should say, piggybacking on the whole idea of playing on Yucata, there are several games in my collection where I first experienced playing them on Yucata, and then actually I liked them so much that when I found a copy for a reasonable price, I would pick them up. Right, Founding Fathers being one of them. So anyway, this game is very educational. All right, you have a cool board representing the assembly hall, where all these political blokes got together, right, to figure out how to found this great country of ours, right? But sort of speaking to how educational it is, though, there's so much behind. Right? You have all the different political players involved at the time, and what's more is their effects and what they do in the game mechanically. It reflects, they're thematic. What they do in the game mechanically is thematic in the sense that it represents what they're known for historically. So again, just a great example of how these games can be very educational. Look at the detail that you get that's historical, in addition to just how to play the game, right? There's this historical extra, and there's the blurb on how to actually play. But again, the other side, when it's your the downtime, right? It's not your turn. You can literally read and learn about these various characters that you're portraying in the game. I think, is this the rule book? Yeah, this is the rule book where it goes into detail, right? They didn't have to do this, but that's what they put into the rule book. All this extra detail about all these, again, political figures, right? So another great example of a game I would consider highly educational that is in my collection. One cool game that comes to mind as being, a couple actually right here, as being educational would be Wingspan. So this was designed by Elizabeth Hargrave, Elizabeth. And I don't know what Elizabeth does. It's something, she's involved with birds, and it's something sciencey. It's like a bird scientist or something along those lines. And I should have known that, but anyway, this game became super popular because she's also into strategy board games, and so she, combined her love of the two and created honestly a great game, which is interesting too because it's one of those where it appeals to not only in a certain segment that bird enthusiasts, right, but it also then brings gamers and other people that play it who might not have had that love of birds to begin with. It exposes them to, bird watching and that sort of culture, and might spark that interest. Because getting back to the general point about being educational, naturally, given who the designer is and how academic she is and so on, this is extremely, educational in the sense that it portrays all these birds that it has in the game. They're all distinct, and they all have accurate, their information is accurate in terms of their habitat, their tendencies, and so on. And so that comes out in the game as well, because certain birds you're putting into your, forest habitat, certain birds in your water habitat, and so on. And again, so you're learning as you're playing and having fun, with these games. Wingspan, a great example. One that, again, recently was super popular. I'd almost consider it an example. We talked about gateway games, right? How Catan was my gateway game. I'd almost say it's one of the recent examples of a recent gateway game. Now it is maybe slightly more complex than something like Catan, but I think it is, simple enough and easy enough where, just average everyday people might get into it. And it is a beautiful looking game too. So there, wow, what is this? Because the dice come out of a little birdhouse. I should have showed you that, set it up, but it brings your attention to the game on the table as well. It looks nice and it's immersive. So yeah, another great game, maybe an example again of a contemporary gateway game. So that's Wingspan. Evolution, where did that go? So on this point of being educational, here you're creating a species using these different sort of trait cards. And it's very educational in the sense that you learn sort of what's necessary to survive out in the wild, right? And if you have this sort of trait, then you're able to gain this advantage, but then this other species has this trait, and you have a weakness because you focused on this one thing. You have a weakness to their trait, right? So, and it's all based on real, so to speak, evolutionary traits that you can get. So what are some examples here? Defensive herding, just going through a couple of the cards here. What's this one? Oh, defensive herding again. Burrowing, right? Certain cards, which then again give you, not to go too deep into what the game's all about and how it works. Here's hibernation, but just to give you examples of some of the traits then that you can attach to your species as you're developing them and as you're evolving them, I suppose. And so then it's like a fight for food. There's a limited food supply. And some cool thing about this game is your species can be carnivorous or not, right? And in which case you can attack the other species or not, right? You might just eat plants or you might eat the other species. So there's that dynamic as well. And so as is always the case, right? Historically, there's this limited food supply and typically too much population, too many species, and so there's that element involved. But in general, just wanted to speak again to how there's that educational process involved in playing a game like Evolution. Not to mention, so it's called Evolution Climate. This version of Evolution included this climate element where then you have to factor in, right? Certain species are in, heavier species are better off in, say, when it's colder in colder environments versus it's better to be lighter and not weigh as much in hotter environments and so on. So you have to factor in these environmental factors and potential other environmental threats. So again, great example of how educational some of these strategy board games are. Love playing this with my kids as well. They got into this one, and again, I feel like not only is it fun to be engaging in this activity with them, but then also they're learning in the process. Okay, kind of speaking to that, how engaging in this experience with them, with the exception of solitaire games. One benefit of these strategy board games is it brings us together, right? We're doing things together, experiencing an activity together, right? As Aristotle famously says in Politics, man is by nature a social animal, right? A lot of us think of ourselves as hermits maybe, or think, we like to be alone, but the truth is we need most of us anyway, right? Some participation in, social activities. Let's put it that way. And so strategy board games, if you're in a gaming group, let's say, that obviously affords you an opportunity to get together with others and experience that. So, again, board games, perfect opportunity to do that. They are adaptable. So one of the things I wanted to say is versus other leisure activities, right, where maybe it takes 2.5 to 3 hours, maybe you only have 30 minutes, right? We have different games, right, are playable in different time periods. So maybe you have Friday night and you want to get together with your friends, but a couple of you only have like an hour long, an hour a period of time. You can't go to the movies together, but maybe you can get together and play a strategy board game. So again, these offer us a good opportunity to get together and do something with one another. Consider one of the labels or tags that's oftentimes associated with certain strategy board games, after all, is a party game. And what does a party mean? It means a group getting together, a group of us getting together and having fun, basically. And so there's a whole genre of these strategy board games that are known as party games, where you get together and it's a group, right? So these games cater to, again, the bigger groups. And so you have I brought examples here. One example that I like, Wits and Wagers. I'm terrible with trivia. My wife's the opposite. She remembers all kinds of intricate historical details and so on. I have a terrible memory, and so naturally I am terrible with trivia. But one thing I like about Wits and Wagers is that it's kind of a trivia game, but it's not just you guessing. You are then wagering on all the guesses that were submitted. So even if you have no clue what the answer is, you can still do really well and win the game, not having any idea initially what the answers were, by sort of working off what the other guesses were. So kind of cool element that this brings to the table versus other trivia games. But it's known as and I brought the party version out, and I actually have a couple different versions of Wits and Wagers. It's known as a party game. This literally can play, what does it say in the box? 4+. It doesn't even cap it, right? Because I've heard of conventions where they'll get a whole big room full of people playing, and they'll segment them off into, say, like 8 groups, where then all those 8 groups, everybody in a group will work together to formulate that group's answer. So this can literally play anywhere from 4 to hundreds, right? So it's a great example of a party game, and one that I in particular like. One other example, One Night Werewolf. So you might have heard of this one. This is a pretty popular social deduction game where you get together with a lot of friends or whoever, and whoever's in your gaming group or whoever's there for that occasion. You pull this out. This is actually one that plays pretty quick. So I mentioned, you can have quick games, you can have long games. For sale, this one plays in 10 minutes. Literally, the first time I ever played this was like 5 minutes, and I couldn't believe it was actually over. So some of these games, again, if you don't have a lot of time, you can bring them out, play them quick. The reason why I'm echoing that point again is because the social deduction game typically takes, as it says on the box, about 10 minutes. So you play it over and over and over. Typically, people are having a lot of fun. That's why you're playing it, right? So you might play it 6, 7, 8 times in a row. And so there's different characters that the different players are, and that's their role. And everybody closes their eyes. And there's so a lot of these social games or party games, or some of these games in general. I mentioned XCOM in the previous part 2 of part 2. Right, they'll have apps, right, on the phone that'll sort of be incorporated in the gameplay. And so XCOM is an example, that board game, co-op board game that I mentioned earlier. It has a part of the game that requires the app, and so too in One Night Werewolf, the app will be going, and so everybody will have their eyes closed, and as the different roles that the players are playing, right, they'll have a token or a card that tells them their role. As each of those roles comes up, the narrator on the app will say, okay, the witch, you may open your eyes and do whatever the witch does, right? So each character has a unique ability, and so certain, the werewolf's trying to do something in particular, and each character has a certain way that they win, right? But so anyway, that's an example, and there's all kinds of different versions, all these different they're kind of expansions. They offer more and more characters or roles that the players can play. So that's an example again of a kind of a party game, one that involves social deduction, because you're trying to figure out the deuce, right? Who the different people are, who your friends are, like what are their roles, right? Who's the werewolf, and so on. So all these games, they're great ways of getting groups together, getting us together, and having fun. And again, very thematic. A lot of these are very thematic. I mentioned earlier how, so similar to sort of being a social experience for us, and I've alluded to how I love playing these games with my kids. So I sort of segueing off that, I wanted to emphasize how I think that strategy board games can offer a great family experience. So just recently I mentioned how we've been playing. It's here somewhere. Mysterium. My kids and myself, we played this several times and have really been enjoying this one. Codenames. So over the years, Abby, my oldest, she has grown to not necessarily enjoy playing them as much, or at least as much as she used to. With certain games, I have a fondness for because even she enjoys, and so it's something that as she's getting older, it's harder and harder to find things that we both enjoy, right? Because I'm a grown man, and she's a growing young woman, I suppose you could say. And so when I can find something that we can both do and that we both enjoy, I love it. And ideally, she'd love to play all the strategy board games, just like I do. But that's not as much the case anymore, like I said. But one game that she likes in particular is Codenames, and so just wanted to point that one out. Give a shout out to this game again. Might be an example of a gateway game. Another example of a deduction game where you're trying to figure out what based on clues from your partner. Trying to figure certain things out. So Abby really enjoys that one, and I'm pointing these ones out because again, these particular games because they're ones that resonate with me with respect to the family, right, and bringing my kids up and raising my kids. I've raised my kids then on strategy board games, and there's a lot to be said for doing that, I think, which I'll speak to more here in a little bit. So I wanted to echo what I mentioned earlier, and that's the adaptability, or how should I put this? In some sense, how adaptable the time element is when it comes to strategy board games. So you have games that play and still offer you that sense of strategy. Now, obviously, if you're only playing a game that's 10 minutes long, how intense can that strategy be when by definition you're talking about something long term, right? But still, there's still that sense of strategy you can offer in a 10-minute game versus, and I don't have too many examples of these, but like some war games and other board games that gamers are familiar with can take 6 hours, right? So there is this variability, maybe that's the right way to put it, in terms of how long do you have on this particular day to engage in a leisurely activity with your friends? Okay, that long. Well, let me we have this game that we can play, right? So they're nice in the sense that, again, they offer that variability. So maybe you have, it's a holiday and you have all day and you're together with extended family. You don't get to see a lot and you enjoy these types of games. And maybe you want the 6-hour experience, right? Maybe you don't have that. Maybe you literally only have 10 minutes. You could pull out again for sale. So I think that does distinguish these strategy board games from other leisurely activities, at least if you have a few in your collection, right? Which then represent that variability that's on offer, which I do. But I guess I should grant that, if you only have a couple in your collection, maybe they're just, I would say typical, right? What's a typical length for a strategy board game? Maybe about an hour. There's no average, honestly, right? There's so much variability, but an hour or slightly less, I think, is, if I had to say, right, if I was forced to pick out what the average playing length of these strategy board games is, I would say about an hour. But again, it could go anywhere from 10 minutes to 6+ hours to multiple days, honestly. And if you've ever played Risk and consider that a strategy board game, these games can literally, or diplomacy, I've heard of diplomacy games going on literally days, weeks, and so on, depending on, maybe you have other things going on, right? You might have to put the game on pause, leave it like it is, and then return to it when everybody can. So anyway, the time investment is variable, something that's variable, which I think is a boon to these strategy board games. Yeah, so another thing that I alluded to again in the UMKC assignments, right, and for that entrepreneur program was, and I think it's a good point, the notion that as opposed to, like, let's say going to the movies or going to a sporting event, these other leisurely activities, a strategy board game, not only is it fun, right, and provide you satisfaction for that particular Friday night, but it's long lasting, right? It doesn't go away. The game doesn't end, so to speak, in the sense like that particular baseball game you went to, right? Unless you buy another ticket, you can't play it. You can't see it again next Friday. Well, a strategy board game, right? You buy it, you have it, and then you could revisit it every Friday night if you desire to, right? So again, it's something that can be enjoyed once purchased, again and again and again and again. And I think there are some classics when it comes to these strategy board games that will be handed down, let's say in my family, from generation to generation, where you are literally playing these games again and again and again. Maybe not every Friday, but once a month for years, for decades, and so on. And I would, point out the price again is roughly equivalent. So not only is that true, but you're only spending as much as, say, going to the movies 3 or 4 times, right? Or family going to a minor league baseball game or something like that, right? So it's not like it's a huge financial investment either. Granted, they're not necessarily cheap, but if you're going and doing these other leisurely activities, which again expire that night, let's say, is it really that much of an investment when you think about how many times you can actually revisit strategy board games? I don't know that it's that much of an investment when you consider it that way. And so, going through the tables that I created for that assignment back for that program, you can see sort of this first table how I broke it down, comparing so Kansas City Royals baseball game here, how much it costs for a family of 4, comparing that, right? So how much does all these leisurely activities, how much does it cost for a family of 4 to do each one? And you can see that board game is relatively cheap just on the face of it in terms of its purchase price, right? Not factoring in, again, that you can revisit it over and over and over, right? So that's also true of the Xbox 360 game console, which I list as an example here of something you could purchase for the family of 4. I go through other aspects that you had to sort of dive into for these business assignments that I'm not going to get into here, but as you go down some of those rows, you can see how I'm again speaking to how valuable really these strategy board games are in my mind when you consider that you can return to them again and again and again. Now, granted, you have to enjoy playing them, and not all of us do, but if you do, right, I think it behooves you to consider, again, that's a huge value when it comes to these strategy board games, is that you can revisit them over and over and over. You can't go back to that specific Royals game that you have a ticket for on that particular date. You can't keep, only spend that initial, $100 and keep getting it over and over and over every Friday like you can with the board game. Okay. So, and then what is the second table there? Again, just kind of getting into some of the values I associate with board games as opposed to other leisurely activities. Another thing, so I mentioned there, is you could resell them, right? So they retain value. So let's say you grow tired of them, or maybe you enjoyed playing them with your kids, but then they left the house, and so now you don't really ever play it. You can sell them. Most of these strategy board games that I'm talking about, and throughout this episode, will have some value. Somebody somewhere would pay you something for the game if you no longer want it. So you wouldn't just have to donate it, let's say, to Goodwill or something, right? There, you can get something back for it. So that's one of the points I mentioned. Another thing is they are portable, as I mentioned there, as being one of the assets to these strategy games. They're portable. More so true for some of them than others, right? It's more difficult to hold this thing around, right? But say a small strategy card game, a lot, they're pretty easy. Even when it's not that hard even to bring one of these different places, right? So portable, all associated costs, they're minimal, right? That's a benefit to strategy board games. The purchase price lifespan, I alluded to that already. So that's those tables. I want to mention those. Okay, and then finally, I guess the point I would really hammer home, they are, strategy board games after all. Oh, quick example of another very immersive game, right? Thematic game, Shakespeare putting on plays. But last sort of main point in terms of their value that I'd want to hammer home, and that's that they're thinky, right? By definition, as I elaborated on in part 1, you're going to have to think, okay, to at least in order to do well or to win. And so some people enjoy like a crossword puzzle. It can deliver the same sort of, if you enjoy the challenge of a crossword puzzle, it can deliver the same sort of pleasure, the same sort of experience as that. Right? Playing a strategy board game can deliver the same sort of experience. So if you're one who enjoys working out, right, thinking through a problem and figuring out the solution, well, you're going to get a lot, again, from these strategy board games, because to do well, right, you have to flesh certain things out, certain aspects of the game state at certain times, and figure out what paths to victory are most optimal, and so on. You have to make all these different decisions. Again, they're thinky games. Okay, so I guess piggybacking off of that, and something I mentioned earlier, right, it's one of the reasons why I really love raising my kids with these strategy board games, because again, it does require them to do some thinking, right? So, and how so? Well, in a variety of different ways, right? It involves creative problem solving, sort of mathematical. There's a lot of math going on in these strategy board games. Again, at least if you want to do well. And my kids, they're competitive like me. And when we get together and play these games, we're not super competitive, but they want to win. And so to do well, you have to oftentimes do math and figure out, if you take this particular tile, right, is that better? Will that get you as many points as if you took this tile? And how will that affect? You see that your opponent's going for this, and how many more points would it give them if you took this other tile, and so on and so forth, right? You have to make these kinds of calculations, and I love seeing how the older they get, the more and more of these calculations they're making. And so they have to get creative too, right? And sometimes thinking about the best way to pursue victory and maybe change their path to victory, right? When one is no longer as optimal as it initially was, right? They might have to change their path, and that involves like creativity. And so again, I love exposing my kids to experiences, exercises where they're having to think on their feet and be creative to do well. And so again, these strategy board games do that quite well. So I wanted to give you a couple of examples of how that's the case. And actually, as I was kind of thinking about which of these games in my collection did this well, that I remember doing this well with my kids, right, where I could see them kind of like having to calculate and figure things out, and I really enjoyed that. It dawned on me that there are certain games, reflecting back on the times, that there's certain ones that I kind of associated with each of my kids, where I played that particular game with Jack a lot, and that particular game with Sophia a lot. And so I'll go ahead and mention those as well. But a couple of games that kind of stand out in terms of sort of how when I would play these with the kids, I could see like them having to figure things out. One of them is this game Martinique. So this is actually the game I remember playing a lot with Jack, my son. And this is a kind of deduction game, but it's only two of you. And the game, the board is like a treasure map, and it's showing this island. And at the beginning of the game, there's tiles on all these different spaces of the island, except for these map spaces. And so you're moving your pirates along, acquiring these various things which are on these tiles, and also acquiring these various map pieces, which then give you clues as to where the big treasure is somewhere on the map. So if you notice, there's a grid actually, and there's numbers going across here, and then letters going up and down. Well, one of these spaces at the end of the game, right, it's determined at the beginning. One of the spaces, let's say 36 spaces, one of these 36 spaces is going to have the big treasure. And so one of the ways you can win is you can guess at the end the location of the big treasure. And if you are correct, you win the game. And the way you sort of piece that together is by collecting these various map pieces. That give you you can deduce the different map pieces you get tell you the spaces that where the map's not, right? So you can, but the more map pieces you collect, the more you're able to figure out about, where the big treasure is, okay, by crossing spots off the list, more or less. And then there's another way to win if nobody guesses where the big treasure is. But just an example of where you're again are having to think, right, and deduce. Well, I have the 8 spot, the map, so that can't be where the big treasure is, and I have this one, so it can't be there, right? Well, so it must be here or here, right? Putting things together. I just remember Jack when we played this, seeing the proverbial wheels, turning in his mind as he was taking his turn on this one. So a lot of fond memories playing that one, and then again with Jack in particular. Now, one that I played a lot with Abby, my oldest, and haven't really pulled out too much recently per se. I mentioned Codenames earlier. There's so many different expansion or versions, I guess. This one, the pictures version, and so on. But that's those. But anyway, Abby, also a fan of Codenames. I guess that's why I mentioned that there. But one game I remember playing a lot with her was Grave Business. So we don't play this one too much anymore, but again, very thematic, great artwork. But what you're doing, the reason why I'm bringing this up now is there's different tokens on this. I mean, it's kind of macabre, I guess, but you're sort of digging things up, right? And the different things you can get are worth different, have different values, right? So 4 and 2 and so on. And so these are, going across. And so towards the end, you're sort of flipping these up. You're seeing, what the values are. And so at the end of each round, players will take turns sort of digging up a row or a column. And so one of the things you have to do is calculate the values. And if you take this particular row, well, that'll leave certain ones left and so on. You have to make all those, again, various calculations. And for whatever reason, the kids really liked this one growing up, and we played this one a lot. And I didn't mind because there was enough strategy involved. I enjoyed playing it, and I could tell that it was really helping improve their math skills by making these calculations. They would have to, again, do all kinds of math throughout the game. So love that sort of aspect of strategy board games. Again, when it comes to the family and raising kids, how much it can sort of get them thinking, and it certainly can't hurt, right? What does it hurt to have them exercising their mind like this? So I mentioned Abby and Jack, the ones that stood out. So there's Jack and Abby. We played this one a lot. So I thought I would mention real quick, Sophia, my third born daughter, we played Loot a lot. So this is a strategy card game. Again, one where you have to do a lot of math. Played it so much, all the cards are getting bent or were bent. We haven't played it in a while, but you're doing all kinds. There's different colors. There's a long hair in there too. That's probably hers. All kinds of math. There's different gold cards and different colors and so on. So this is one that's playing like age 5. If not even 4, playing at a very early age. I remember playing this one with her, and fast forward now 5 years later, and she's very good at math, and I like to think that, at least in part, it may be due to all those games of Loot that we played. And she'll appreciate this because it's true that she really had my number in this game too. I don't know what it was. It's not that I wasn't trying. Now there's a fair amount of luck in this one. We talked about luck and how that will mitigate, the strategy involved and so on. But she really had my number in this game too. I always had trouble, for whatever reason, beating her in Loot. So that was the game that Sophia and I would play a lot, at least when she was younger. Now Zoe, my youngest, so right now, she will be 7 here in a month and a half. She requests Corinth a lot, is the one she likes, and this is a dice roller. So you roll the dice, and then based on what's rolled, take turns doing different actions. So she really likes that one. Oh, and the other one I was going to point out for Zoe is this one called Micropolis, where you're putting together like this ant hill with all these different tunnels, and there's all these different, we talked about Path to Victory, there's different ways you can score points and thus ultimately win the game. Zoe's a big fan of this one. So if it's her turn to recommend a game, it's usually going to be Micropolis or Corinth, at least recently. So love bringing up the kids on these games, really for all the reasons I alluded to. Makes them think, they're fun, right? They're a way to get together, right? For people of different ages. Again, how many different things do we have how many things do we have in common given these disparate ages at play? Strategy board games oftentimes gives us something to bridge that age gap, I would argue, right? Whether you're 70 or 7, you can get into a lot of these same games. So yeah, I think I said most of what I want to say in terms of what I find valuable about playing, or why I think people should play strategy board games in general. Naturally, going to myself, what do I in particular, why is it that I'm drawn to these? For a lot of the same reasons, basically. I love think through problems. As I mentioned, I'm a philosopher. I like to think, so that's not that surprising. I'm very creative by nature, and so I love sort of the creative elements that these games afford you in terms of different ways to win. And then so I wanted to say a little bit about designing games too. The creative, I love the way in which designing strategy games allows me to fulfill that creative desire I have, right? I mentioned how I'm a pretty creative person, so I have to, again, fulfill that creative fix, get that creative fix somehow, and I love doing that by designing these strategy games. So again, strategy board games, I get a ton from them. Again, fulfills that sort of creative aspect of my nature. There's also, I love the sort of, in terms of designing them, I love the kind of balancing involved in terms of, if you're going to offer a good game, at least it better be balanced, meaning that, so we mentioned all the different paths to victory and ways you can win. Well, if one's obviously way better than others, there's not really multiple paths to victory. There's only one, right? So what I mean is, you better have the game balanced then, right? And what we mean by saying a game is balanced, well balanced, is that there's not one obvious strategy or path to victory that all players should take, right? There's multiple viable routes. Okay, so if that's the case, then the game's well balanced. I like that process. I've always been really good at math. I've mentioned, right, that I'm a stats nerd, and so naturally the math involved in designing these games appeals to me as well, right? Fleshing out, how valuable certain tiles can be, and trying to keep, a certain standard, let's say, right? Having to weigh these different factors. Love that sort of aspect. I love the research involved as well. So, I mentioned how educational playing these games can be. Well, so too, when you're designing these games, at least if you're, worth anything, I think, right? At least if it's going to be reflective of reality, right, historically, then you're going to be doing some research. And so it's going to be educational for you. And I love that part of it as well. So some examples of some of my games where I've had to do research, really all of them entail, I would say, some degree of research for me, some way more than others. I've made some games on philosophy. That's probably going to take a little bit less of my time to research it, since I already am familiar with a lot of it. But even that, and I'll mention, what is it, 2 parts from now, if we ever get there, I'll mention this game in more detail, my philosophy related games. But some of the first one I made that's philosophy related, Philosopher Kings, I still did a ton of research for. So even the ones I'm well versed in, the related to things I'm well versed in, I still invested a lot of time doing research and learning. And so, I have a game, where you're a psychologist, and I have a background in psychology as well. But I spent hours, learning the nuances of the various, or familiarizing myself with the various nuances of the psychological disorders that the players will be curing as these psychologists in the game. What sports cards or what coins are the most valuable historically. I researched that when I made my games on coin collecting and collecting, sports cards. So a lot of the research involved, and I like that process. So love those all. I mentioned three different elements, right? Sort of this sense in which it satisfies my creative desires, right? Mentioned again, sort of how they're educational and require me to do some research, and then finally, the second thing I mentioned, right, the math elements involved in balancing the game. I love all those different aspects, and I thought I'd mention real quick, give you an example. I'm not going to spend too much time detailing this here, but give you an experience where I remember sort of all three of these things, coming to the forefront and being the case, right? So again, going back to that experience I had in the UMKC mentor or scholars program, they would put you in contact with various mentors throughout the process. People who had their own projects and were successful and so on. And one of the mentors I worked with and met with on a few occasions, he was familiar with my Fantasy Football, the board game, and mentioned how, oh, that would be awesome. He thought it would be really cool he was a big college basketball fan, particularly the Kansas Jayhawks, and mentioned how it would be awesome to have the same experience, but with college basketball. And so, boom, he mentions that, and all of a sudden, I'll get into my design process, and again, I think 2 parts from now. But once I get an idea, oftentimes, again, given my obsessive nature, I homed in on it, and I had to get a game out. And so that was actually the impetus then for, what was this, game number 33. So I pulled this out of the door for this discussion, Fantasy Basketball, the board game. Then it was, what was the impetus for it? Him suggesting this. I actually have a vivid memory of this as we had a beer at the time, him saying all this stuff, and I remember thinking, oh, that's actually a good idea. It would be I was more into basketball at that time as well, and the Jayhawks were doing particularly well, I believe, at the time. And so, I was like, wow, that really does seem like a good idea. And so going to the sense in which this feeds my need to be creative. Well, how do I make this game? How do I capture basketball, in a board game? So I had to be creative, and I went through the process and fleshed things out. And over time, created basically a board game where not only you're playing basketball, but like my football game, where you're then also putting together a team based on whether it's real legends, contemporary real players, or ridiculous, Sesame Street characters, or just yourself. You can even create yourself, right? It's Fantasy Basketball, the board game, and right. So I created all that. All right, I went through different, made boards here. These are different versions that I had. And again, having to flesh all this stuff out, exercise, right, that creative component of my nature, figuring this stuff out. How does this go? I think this might have been the finalized board, put that together, something like that. Anyway, so I had to get creative and figure out how to capture basketball in a board game. How do you do that? I'm not going to get into that here other than to just say, I had to figure that out and engage again in that creative sort of process. I had to balance things, right? So one of the things, I did, as I mentioned, all these different players, and they had their different ratings, and those ratings would affect different things that happen in the game. So, you can attempt to steal. Well, that hinges on their ball, the player with the ball, your opponent's player with the ball, their ball handling rating. And it also hinges on your own player's steal rating. And so there's all these different ratings. And so, I didn't want certain players overly powerful. Granted that, I want the Michael Jordans and so on to be really, really good. I didn't want, certain ones to necessarily be too good. And so there's that sense in which the whole point being, you want to balance things. You want to balance things. How do I make it so that there's this even back and forth sense, and not where one person's taking, doing 10 different things on their turn before the other person then gets their turn, right? How do I accomplish all these things? How do I balance the underlying ratings and numbers? How do I, in that game, I remember, right? How do I even determine whether a shot's made or not, right? It had to involve dice rolls, but I didn't want too much of that, right? How do I factor in the players and their ratings, and then at the same time factor in these dice rolls? And, how do I then balance that based on the different spots in the court where they're at, right? Right. So out here, I want it to be a certain chance that they make it with a certain rating versus in here and so on, right? So that's all requiring, again, this balancing. And then speaking to the third thing, right, that sense of education and research, I'm a sports nerd. I know a decent amount of basketball, but I was never necessarily a basketball fanatic. So I was familiar with, most of the, legends and their names, but I wasn't necessarily, I didn't necessarily know who the top 10 rebounders were of all time or anything like that. So I would literally then, and doing this game, designing this game, I went in and looked at all the stats. I know who had, or at least I did at the time, right? Who has the most steals of all time, who has the most assists, and so on. Excuse me. So, again, speaking to how much research is involved in the design process, and I really do enjoy. Excuse me. I really do enjoy all three of those component parts, right? The creative aspect, the balancing of the numbers and the math and the stats involved, right? And then the generally the research that you have to do to accurately portray at least whatever it is that your game's about. So, yeah, I got into. Is that everything I wanted to say? I think that might be everything I wanted to say. Again, I ran through a lot in this part 3 here, where I was basically speaking to what the value of playing and designing these strategy board games is. So that's been part 3. Now in the next part 4, we'll go ahead and dive into and take a look at my collection. So you've already seen through all these various initial parts, right, different games in my collection. But we'll take a deeper dive, a closer look at my collection. I'll give you some stats, if you will, and talk a little bit about how it was that I came to acquire the games I have.